Following two very big court cases, including our continuing coverage of the young man behind the Tops massacre a little more than 6 months ago, earlier today pleading guilty to state charges. As we've been mentioning, he will spend the rest of his life in prison and family members will avoid having to go through that trial. But what about the federal charges, which could include the death penalty? We'll have some insight on that in a moment. First, though, a case here in Buffalo argued this morning before the U.S. Supreme Court. This is related back to the Buffalo billion scandal and the two men that you see on the right there. Our partners at Investigative Post first exposed back in 2014 that a state official, Elaine Caballeros, who you see there, and local developer Louis Simonelli rigged the bidding process so that Simonelli's construction company would get the contract to build a massive plant at Riverbend. It is now the home to Tesla's Gigafactory. Both men were convicted on felony fraud and bribery charges, but the Supreme Court seems poised to potentially overrule those convictions. At issue is the so-called right to control theory, saying that instead of defrauding the state out of money, prosecutors argue that they deprive the state from its right to control the process. You could hear the skepticism in the justices' voices during oral arguments at the High Court this morning.
The jury was instructed on this right to control theory, and they convicted on that theory. You seem to be suggesting that we can go back now and look at the evidence that was presented and say, oh, but there was enough for another theory that the jury wasn't instructed on, and so we can sustain the conviction on that basis.
Joining us live now to discuss is Jim Heaney, editor of Investigative Post. He broke the bid rigging story that led to the investigations that eventually led to the convictions. So, Jim, we're going to talk in a moment with attorney Paul Cambria to kind of help us understand what happened in the Supreme Court today. We played that clip there from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, but it was similar sentiment from all of the justices on the court. I mean, it sounds like this is a technicality, but there seems to be little doubt that the Supreme Court may overturn these convictions. I think your point to everyone, and if you can help us, kind of go back a few years and understand what this scandal was all about. Wrongdoing occurred, whether it was violating a specific federal statute or not.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's clear that the company and the state conspired to write bid specifications that only Simonelli's company originally was eligible to meet. I called them out on it. They revised it, but they still gave the contract to his firm at a fee that was considered excessive. It was $20 million. It was 3.5% of the cost of the project, which was considered by industry standards at 3.5%, was considered excessive. So, they just didn't play by what most people would consider to be ethical rules. Whether or not it met some technical requirements of the law or not, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a judge, I'll leave it up to the Supreme Court.
So you wrote in your newsletter this week, though, that in light of whatever happens here with the Supreme Court, even if these convictions are overturned, these two men did spend a significant amount of time behind bars in federal prison before they were released on appeal. And they've also lost a lot outside of the court system. What did you mean by that?
Well, they served some time. Lou's penalty was 4 months out of 28 months. He lost his business. His company was the biggest development firm in Western New York. It's out of business. His son has picked up the pieces, but Lou's out of business. Lou Simonelli's out of business. And he's left Buffalo. I mean, he used to be a, quote, pillar of the community, and he's pretty much, left in shame. Elaine Caballeros was making about $1 million a year. Is the nanotech guru out of Albany. He got fired. He's a pariah in his industry as well. So one way or the other, no matter what the Supreme Court rules, these gentlemen have paid a severe price. We'll see what the Supreme Court says.
Jim Heaney is editor of Investigative Post, again, which broke this story, geez, Jim, like 8 years ago? Now this has been going on for a long time. We appreciate you coming in.
Thanks, Michael.
All right, now let's turn live to defense attorney and two on your side legal analyst Paul Cambria. So Paul, again, I'm going to ask you in a moment about the big developments today in the top shooting case, but let's pick up on the discussion that I was just having there with Jim. And I played the clip there of Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. I think kind of making the case that all of the justices were making during the Q&A today, that they're skeptical of this right to control theory, which is what prosecutors use to secure these convictions. What is your takeaway in kind of helping non-lawyers who are watching us right now understand what happened in court?
Well, I think that what happens is the Supreme Court says, was this a valid theory of fraud? And if it was not a valid theory of fraud, they should not have been prosecuted under that theory. The government seems to concede this by saying, well, but there's another theory. The problem with that is that theory was never raised. They never had a chance to defend against it. And now, frankly, the only thing the Supreme Court really probably will do is to reverse this conviction and to vacate it. And if that happens, the statute of limitations has probably expired on any other possible charges. And it means if this was an invalid theory that these men were convicted, and they should not have been.